Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Wednesday Night Live. Simon Jacobs is my name. I welcome you all, those of you that I recognize and those of you that are new, as well as online, to classes titled to this evening. I shouldn't say this evening because some places in the world it's not evening. It's just an old habit that we're bound by time and space when the truth is we're not. Are You a Loner is the title. And it's dedicated in memory, loving memory of Lydia Garbuz. So may this class and all that it inspires and benefits to myself and to all of you and everyone be in her honor and her soul be empowered by it, and in turn all her loved ones and family. If anyone's interested, by the way, in dedicating a future class, you can just contact us either online or my office. Okay, are you a loner? So anybody here feels that they're a loner? One loner in the room? A lone wolf? Are you a lone wolf? Or like a lone pigeon?
A loner around a lot of people.
Okay. So loneliness is a fascinating topic. I mean, it's also a sad topic, loneliness. I remember once giving a talk, it was Friday night, Upper West Side of the Kabbalah shul, and I was speaking about loneliness. I guess I mentioned existential loneliness, and which is of a unique sort of loneliness. It's not necessarily due to a particular sense of isolation or loneliness. It's just an existential loneliness that we're alone in this world in many ways. And I saw an elderly woman sitting and crying in the corner, and afterwards she said to me, "Please don't talk about existential loneliness again." It made her very sad. And I just remember the vivid image of it. So loneliness is a topic that's difficult to speak about because, like many of the silent emotional experiences in our lives, they're silent for a reason, because we're not so conscious of it. And we don't even want to be that conscious of it. So just like, let's say, fear is a topic I've talked about a number of times here. Fear is another one of those silent killers that the fears, even the ones we know of and definitely the ones we're not aware of, real or imagined, are these debilitating forces that undermine and demoralize you from within. And you can't quite put your finger on it because it's the nature of the enemy is a silent one. It's like doesn't show its face. And similarly, loneliness, which I don't want to equate with fear because it's not necessarily the same, as we shall soon discuss, is like, when you feel lonely, it's not like something you can really sit down and analyze, because what's predominant is the feeling of isolation, the feeling of lack of being understood, the feeling of lack of community, lack of relationships. I mean, there are many different ways to define it, and I want to cover at least the broad spectrum of it, because it's not there's not one type of loneliness either, which just always compounds the challenge. But I'll try to address it from the loneliness that all of us experience in different times. So let me pose a few questions, and then we'll get into the topic at hand. The reason I chose to speak about it is, first of all, it's a good topic to talk about any time. Unfortunately, loneliness is always around, one way or another. Some people are aware of it, some people are not. But also additionally, it's this week's chapter in the Torah is a double chapter, Sazri Mitzorah. And reading about the Mitzorah, I had this sad feeling, because the Mitzorah is the leper, the Talmudic leper, the biblical leper, which actually is not a leper as in the conventional sense. It was a spiritual disease that only existed in those times, as Maimonides writes. But what made the leper unique was that he was isolated. He had to be sent out of the community, almost like not excommunicated, but because of his toxicity and his spiritual impurity, he was a danger to others. So he was sent outside of the community. Chutz megimel machnas, as the Torah says. And it's quite, when you read about it, you feel like a certain empathy for a person who's so toxic that he can't be around others until he goes through a healing process, obviously, which is the goal. And even though this is a biblical and in some ways not relevant in the technical sense of the word, but the spiritual lessons of it are tremendous. So the Mitzorah is maybe the quintessential loner in a way, where he feels like a pariah, the pariah mentality. So that's one of the reasons I chose to talk about it. But I think to be a little more presented in a more sophisticated manner, loneliness, as I said, is far more complicated than it sounds. The first gut reaction most of us have to the word is a negative reaction. Lonely means someone doesn't have someone to talk to, they don't have a companion, they don't have people, kindred spirits, etc., which is the negative side. But the truth is, if you start asking yourself the question, is there such a thing as healthy loneliness? Or is all loneliness unhealthy? Is all loneliness inappropriate? What about the uniqueness that we have? I remember, and I'm sure all of you remember, when you come of age, you may have gone to school with a bunch of friends for years and years as children, and then you start becoming a teenager, and then an adolescent, and then a teenager. I think that's the order, right? If I recall correctly. And then you would turn into, you graduate, or you're like at the end of school, where you start discovering yourself as an individual. What makes you unique as opposed to your colleagues? And there's a certain stage that everybody goes through, there's a certain transition where you feel sometimes completely alone, like a stranger. That all these people you know for the last 15 years, and you did everything with them, you played with them, you went to school, you went to the park, you went to camp, all this, and suddenly you're so different than they are. So the fact that you were in their proximity for so long doesn't necessarily mean you're the same, made of the same cloth. And I don't know if you recall this stage, but for some people it's a very unsettling state, because it's like a transition from the child to the adult, suddenly becoming an adult that's responsible for yourself. Of course, it goes hand in hand with the other transition, which is cutting the umbilical cord. I don't mean physically, that happens at birth. I mean the psychological umbilical cord, as we turn from children into adults, where you're no longer just an extension of your parents, under their protection, under their guidance. Whether they're healthy or unhealthy is not relevant right now, because either way, children at some point, even the healthiest parents, children are affected and shaped by their parents. But comes a point for everyone of what Abraham, what the Torah says about Abraham, Lech lecha ma'artzecha u'moladtecha u'beis avicha, which means the first commandment of the first Jew in the beginning of Genesis, early chapters of Genesis, Lech lecha, leave your land, your birthplace, and the home of your parents, which is the story of every person's life. There's a point where you have to leave the home of your parents. In many ways. I don't just mean physically, also emotionally and psychologically. And I say this is even to the healthiest parents. We're not talking about leaving because parents are a negative influence, even a very healthy influence. Because there's a point where you have to begin to be yourself. Now, you could have the blessings of your parents, and they shaped you, and they helped give you the strength and courage in the best case scenario. Obviously, in the worst case scenario, or not such great scenarios, there's even a stronger reason to leave the influence of your parents, because they could also be dysfunctional and have a negative impact. But everybody has a point where you need to begin to build my life, you, me. And there is initial stages. Thank God it doesn't happen overnight. You don't suddenly become from a child an adult. It's a transition. And a healthy transition, there will be unsettling, like every transition, is when you go from one state of being to another, is always going to be some discomfort. That's the nature of the beast. Just like a caterpillar becomes a butterfly and has to go through the cocoon, through the chrysalis, that transition. So I'm sure the moment that the cocoon begins to open and the butterfly becomes a butterfly and begins to fly, you wonder, does it still remember that it was once a caterpillar that couldn't fly? And does the caterpillar know it's going to become a butterfly? These are things we ponder about. So in Kabbalistic and Hasidic thought, there's a very poetic way how it's phrased. It's called Yesh, Ayin, Yesh. That's Hebrew words, which means Yesh means a state of being. Ayin means a void or a vacuum, a non-state of being, leading to another Yesh, to a new state of being. Basically, every metamorphosis goes through these three stages. You begin as a certain identity. You have to lose your identity to be able to become a greater identity. And there's no way around that. Every process of growth requires those three steps. Anyone thinks they can jump from yesh to yesh, meaning from one state to another without the vacuum in between, is mistaken. Because by definition, a new state means that you have to somewhat shed your old skin in order to assume new skin. So there's that transitional state that, for example, you plant a seed in the ground. If you ever see how a seed begins to sprout, the seed begins to rot as it turns into turns into the first sapling. So everything is this way. A mother goes through birth pains to give birth to a beautiful child, creativity is a child of frustration. The greater the creativity, the greater the frustration that precedes it. Basically, you always need essentially a type of confusion and a certain state of a certain upheaval to really grow from one state to another. Actually, if you think about it this way, it makes it a lot easier to go through difficult moments. Because if you recognize that that's a necessity for growth, then it's just a step toward the growth. It's uncomfortable because for the moment, you're losing your bearings of your past life. But all growth requires that type of step. I mean, that's somewhat of a tangent, but I want to go back to the topic. So as a person grows into an adult, there is going to be a state of loneliness. Children, generally speaking, I mean, they may say they're lonely and they're bored or something, but loneliness is more or less an adult condition. Children know how to stimulate themselves, and they get themselves. I'm not talking about extreme situations where a child is isolated, God forbid, or deprived, or et cetera, But in a normal circumstance, a child's needs are not that extensive. If it gets the right attention, the nurturing, and the care that a healthy parent should provide, a child more or less grows with that. But when you start becoming a sense of self, when you begin to recognize yourself as a sense of self as apart from others, that's where the phenomenon called loneliness can emerge. So, in this context, loneliness may not be such a terrible thing. It's you becoming and recognizing that you're a unique individual. Unique means that you have certain strengths or a certain way of looking at things that someone else just may not have. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's actually what makes you special. Would you prefer to just be a clone or a copy of someone else and then everybody understands you? And you understand them because you're all the same? At the same time, it's still not easy to deal with because we always want to have someone to talk to. Who doesn't want to have someone to talk to about their inner feelings? So the example I gave was that stage where a person begins to, I'd say late teens usually, and you hear this very often. I remember I was a little older student. I was working in my office. I remember a friend of mine who was 4 or 5 years younger than I, but he was a very smart guy. And he came to me and he was like describing this new state, like he felt like something's the matter with him, because he's starting to become aware of himself. You know, I don't know if any of you remember this stage. I remember it pretty clearly. I still remember it. I'm still living through this trauma of becoming a teenager. You know, I know I'm quite older than that, but I still remember it. Anyway, so I remember telling him, I said, you're not crazy. Everybody goes through this. You know, some people feel it more acutely. Actually, people who are more sensitive and more aware are going to feel it stronger. And suddenly, you know, you feel like you're very different. Until you learn to adjust, hopefully, and then you learn to manage and realize that, okay, now you've become an adult, now you've become a butterfly, and now it's time to start writing the script of your life. So in a very healthy world, in a healthy upbringing, good parents will prepare a child for that stage, that when they come of age, just like a bird has to get to a state where it flies away from its nest, it's a blessing for parents to see their child be able to fly on their own. And in that sense, yes, there's an element of certain sadness because you're no longer a child, you're no longer just being provided and nurtured by another, but you learned how to nurture yourself now. You can build your own life. I mean, what greater joy is there to a parent than to see their children get married and see their children have children? I mean, these are the signs of a healthy development, and you want them to have their life. Again, I'm speaking all in healthy terms. I'm not talking about parents who have problems with all these things, because that's a whole other discussion. Since the evening is not called dysfunctional parenting or childhood, it's talked loneliness, I'm going to stay away from that topic. But so loneliness then turns into something which is more than just a negative, like, you know, I'm lonely and sad and no one to talk to. It also somewhat linked to our own uniqueness. So then you ask yourself another question, and that is, are there some people that are just wired to be loners, and others are social animals, and just, you know, or is loneliness really everybody's destiny? Every one of us has an element of it. The only difference is some people just face it, and some people mask it by covering it up, by keeping themselves so distracted and busy, surrounding themselves with so many friends and so much stimulation, that they never allow themselves that the so-called sense of isolation that loneliness brings. You know, interesting question. You know, I know people, because I talk to many people. People come to talk to me, consult with me, and I see people who are literally the type of social animal, what they call extroverts, and they know everybody, and they're knackers and hackers and everything, They know everybody. And then when you start talking for a little while, you see a very sad soul that is just running from one party to the next and one dinner to the next, and is terrified to be alone for a moment. I remember meeting a guy like that who was like, the most popular guy, the most popular, sexy guy at any party. And everyone thought he was at the top of this, and he came to speak to me, different things. But bottom line, we started talking. I said to him, you ever have dinner alone? Just with one person at home? I'm terrified of that. No way. He saw that would be a failure if he was ever alone. And I said, why? What are you afraid of? He says, what am I going to do alone? What am I going to do? And then when you start looking deeper into his life, you see that his parents were that way, that everything was a distraction. They were never able to sit and think on your own because you're always busy. What do you look like to others? Your reputation. It was all about projecting and never really looking inside. So now you're dealing with a person who's very alone, but never affords the time or energy to even look at it because he's terrified of the concept. One could argue, as I told him, he was a very intelligent guy, and thank God he's on track now. I can't say I did help him to some extent, but I think other things helped him as well. I should rather say, like I like to say, you help people help themselves. And you can't really help anyone. You can help people help themselves. So he became aware of that that you are valuable enough to be alone with yourself. There's nothing to be afraid of. There's nothing afraid to have a conversation with yourself from time to time and process your thoughts instead of always trying to dance around and satisfy this one and please that one, and becomes basically your whole identity defined by juxtaposition to others. Like that Chelem story where the guy goes to the mikveh, to the bathhouse, and he's one of these guys that's suffering an identity crisis. So before he gets into the mikveh, which is getting undressed, and he says, 1 second, I always identify myself by my garments, by my clothing. Once I have no clothing, how will I know who I am? I mean, you got to have this a little imagination. It's one of these, the Chelem stories. So he decides, he's going to tie a little red thread to his toe. So when he comes out of the mikveh, he'll look. If he sees the red thread, he'll know it's himself. That's how the Chelem story goes. Okay, as luck would have it, or as Hashem would have it, whatever, God helped him, and the thread got untied from his toe and attached itself to someone else's toe. He comes out of the bath, he comes out of the mikveh, and he's starting to look. He doesn't see the red thing on his toe. So he looks, he finds a red thing. So he goes over to that guy and says, I know who you are, but who am I? That's the classic Chelem story. Now, I know it sounds ridiculous, but there's very often, people know a lot about who someone else is, and you start looking, maybe my identity is this one, maybe my identity is that one. It doesn't feel good to say that, to acknowledge that, but very often that's what people do. You look at someone who you think is your hero, you'd love to be like that person, maybe that's me. Maybe that's me. And it becomes difficult, increasingly difficult. Can you tell me who you are? Forget about who everybody else is. The Kotzker Rebbe puts it this way, it's about relationships. He says, if I am I because you are you, and you are you because I am not and you are not. But if I am I because I am I, and you are you because you are you, I am and you are. That's the poetic version. In simple English, it means that if my identity is defined by your identity, and your identity is defined by my identity, I am not and you're not. Because we're both dancing, both like the blind leading the blind. Like I thought you know where we're going. No, and I thought you would know where we're going. We both don't know where we're going. I'm looking at you, you're looking at me. That joke about the weather with the Indians and the radio report, the weather report, you ever hear that one? Anyway, the weather broadcaster is, he's coming to, the winter is about to come, and everybody's waiting to hear what his forecast will be, what kind of winter it's going to be. So what he does is he goes out and he looks out through the window, he sees the Indian reservation, and he sees the Indians are gathering wood. In his imagination, they were gathering up more wood than usual, so he was convinced, that means they know that there's going to be a tougher winter. So he gets on his radio, and he says, this winter is going to be a tough winter. Okay. The Indians, when they hear that forecast, they start gathering more wood. So he sees them gathering more wood, so he says, it's even tougher than I thought it would be. Anyway, they're listening to this forecast. He's watching them gather wood. They're both looking at each other. And then the winter happens to be a very mild one. So finally he goes to the Indian reservation. They say, why were you gathering so much wood? They said, because you said it's going to be a tough winter. Why were you saying it's a tough winter? Because you were gathering so much wood, So you come down to is anyone in charge? So when it comes to identities, Many of us are just watching others. I think you told me this, right, last time? When some people go, without names and groups, they go shopping for different like floors or other things, and they'll say, no, what is everybody buying? You know, and they buy what others are buying. And that's how it is. You see this in every website. They say the most popular. You know, like, so most popular must be something good because everybody's buying it. But not necessarily the case. Like in our classroom when we wanted to make our teacher trouble, so one kid would look up to the ceiling, then everyone else would start looking up, the teacher would look up, there was nothing happening, but everybody was looking up. You know, you suddenly see 1,000 people walking down the street a certain way, most likely you'll follow. That's how it is. Whether because we're conformists or because we want to be accepted, whatever the theories are. So it's not so simple and easy to embrace your identity. I should step back before I even say embrace. First of all, to know your identity. Who are you? Most people, when you ask them who are you, they give you their business card, which means what you do, not who you are. Who you are is not that simple to answer because, let's be honest, as I mentioned before with parents, how much of us and our identity is shaped by what our parents expected of us, what schools we went to, social pressures. Who really knows what you would be had you not had all those influences? And I'm not suggesting those influences are all bad, but can you really honestly and easily say, I know exactly what my identity is like? Not such a simple answer, even for an adult. We know what we like to be like, and we know what others like about us, but being able to be true to your own voice is not an easy thing, and it's a very lonely thing. They call it the lonely man on top syndrome. So loneliness, therefore, takes on a much broader discussion than just feeling isolated and feeling out of place or not belonging or disconnected. It touches also on the element of uniqueness and your individuality and your singularity. Now, obviously, the question is balancing all of these. So these are some of the questions I'm just putting on the table and discussing the topic. As I said before, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? And how do we address it? How do we address both? You know, when you really do some soul searching, I think every one of us has a place that is very alone. At the end of the day, no matter how many people love you, no matter how much you're part of a community, an integral part of a community, and you're respected and you're honored and people feel you're needed, at the end of the day, after the party's over, everybody goes home alone. Even if you have a spouse and you have a family, but there's parts of you that walks alone in this earth. Now, some of us face it, as I said. Some of us are afraid to face that. But it's very obvious that all of us have that type of... Because you are the only one that spends all the time with yourself. That's a pretty mathematical certainty. What would you say as an accountant, right? Yeah. Huh? Yeah. And as I said before, many of us are not necessarily more social or more friendly. It's sometimes fear of being alone. So we create all kinds of networks. Today you have also, thank God, with texting and Twitter, and I'm going to go through all the different social media, Facebook, which of course is called friends. You know, they use the word friends. How many friends do you have? Likes. You know, all these words that are very nice, but what do they really mean? And someone who has the most friends on Facebook or the most followers on Twitter, actually the least loneliest person on earth? Not necessarily. Some of the greatest celebrities, some of the people more known than anyone else, are very lonely people. I was talking to a guy a few months ago, became very wealthy, beyond his expectations, but he didn't even make an effort, it just happened. And he tells me he lost all his friends as a result, because all the people that he was really friendly with, now he doesn't know whether they talk to him because of his money or because they're friends. He says, it's always tainted. And I really walk alone, he says. Everything is tainted by my money. And so on one hand, it's a blessing. On the other hand, we all know the story of Howard Hughes, how he became completely isolated, a recluse, to the point of insanity. And a big part of it was not necessarily mental. It was due to the money, the power that he had. So it's not so simple, even though we all love to have all that. Loneliness has nothing to do. You cannot resolve it based on how many friends you have. That can be a distraction. So there are two verses actually in the Torah that use the word lonely, bodod. In Hebrew, loneliness is bedidus, bodod. One is, of course, the saddest day of the Hebrew calendar is Tisha B'Av. And how does the book of Lamentations, Eicha, open up? The first verse, Eicha Yoshva Bodod. Whoa, how sad is it that she sits alone? That's how Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah the prophet, chose to depict the opening description of the destruction of the temple. He doesn't talk about the murders, at least in the opening, doesn't talk about the exile, doesn't talk about the destruction of the temple, the holy temple, seizing all the great work that was done in the temple, cessation of the menorah, of the mizbeach, the offerings and so on, the divine presence. What bothered him most is Eicha Yoshva Badat. Woe that she sits alone. As I've explained a number of times, the reason for that is, why is that worse than everything else? Because we could get through anything in life if you knew that you have someone walking with you. So as bad as something may happen, if you don't have the loneliness, if you know there's someone with you, then you can fight. When you feel completely alone in your pain or and isolated, then you lose hope. Then you lose the strength. You see, for example, even medically, God forbid, people in the hospital who have guests and visitors and gifts and so on, it affects your immune system, affects the willpower, the hope. You feel you can make it. Look at another patient who's lying there, no one comes to visit, they're all alone in this world. It has to affect their morale and their willpower, a simple thing like that. And it's not just a psychological thing, it has real chemical effects. The adrenaline and other forces that do not get stimulated when you don't have people around you. So Yirmiyahu, in his wisdom, realized that the hardest challenge of this exile will be not all the tragedies that took place, but the sense of loneliness. So that's one verse. Then you have at the end of the book of the Torah, at the end of Deuteronomy, you have another bodad. It says, Am levoded yishkan. It talks about the nation of Israel as being a singular, isolated, lonely nation. Am levoded yishkan actually is in Balak. In Parsha Bracha, the pasuk is Moses says, how's it go? But it's the same idea. Let me get the exact verse for some reason. Huh? No. He says the words Badak. Am levoded yishkin. Here we go. Let's see. Just give me a second. What? Talking about Parsha Bracha. 1 second. I'm sorry. What are you referring to? Okay, but you'll find it. You look it up. I don't want to waste more time here looking, but you get all this frustration. I thought it was there. Maybe it's in Hazino? Okay. No scholars in this room that, so I can say whatever I like and nobody's going to contradict me. That's good to hear. Actually, I'm not so happy. Oh, here we go. Vayishkin Yisrael Batach Bodad. Yeah, Batach Bodad. There's a bracha right there. Deuteronomy 33:28. Okay. Vayishkin Yisrael Batach Bodad. It's a pasuk in Chumash. You don't remember it? At least in this Chumash. Hazinu is also. Anyway, point being that here Bodad is used in a positive sense, the lonely Jewish nation as a singular nation. Sometimes in a sad way, because like one sheep, kivsachas ben shivim ze'evim, one vulnerable sheep among 70 wolves, but it's a uniqueness and a singularity. And here in this sense, it's a very positive element, as I said before, that there's a loneliness that comes as a result of your own individuality. So, in looking at the entire picture of it all, let's use Hillel's famous statement. Hillel says, famous one, Imen anili mili. If I won't be for myself, who will be for me? And then he says the second statement, which seems to contradict the first, but it doesn't. Imani la'atzmi ma'ani. If I am for myself, what am I? So which one is it? Self-reliance and the self, or the dependence and the need for others? And the answer, obviously, is both are necessary, but in that order. First, you need to have a self, and then that self is augmented and supported by others. So there's so many beautiful analogies to explain this in nature. In nature, you look at nature. Nature is not nature is not fragmented or compartmentalized. Everything in the world of nature is synchronized. It's one synchronicity. What we'd call harmony within diversity. There's no one entity in nature. There's billions and billions, yet they all work in harmony unless human beings disrupt that harmony. And what does that harmony entail? So using a musical analogy, think of it as many musical notes. So you hear a beautiful symphony, and you break it down. When you hear it, you hear one beautiful music. I mean, with sections and stages and so on, but nevertheless, it's one flowing sound, and it resonates with a harmony in our melody and harmony in our hearts and souls. But if you break it down, technically, a symphony consists of many different instruments and many different notes, as I said, many different stanzas and so on. And yet they all come together as like one flowing entity. So every musical note is absolutely necessary. At the same time, every one note knows it needs all the others. Every musician in the symphony knows that comes their moment, they must play their role. At the same time, they know when they have to stop and let the next player begin, or play together and coordinate. So here you have the perfect example of individuality and at the same time we'll call community, where if any one note or any, for that matter in the human body, any one cell decides that it's completely alone and doesn't care about anything near it, it will destroy the whole project. On the other hand, if you completely lose yourself, in other words, you're not just alone, you say, you know what, there's so many others, I don't feel in any way unique or individual, then again you destroy the whole symphony. So there's the paradox. You need to be completely singular and individual in what you're doing. At the same time, always know that you're part of a bigger picture. Now in nature and in the human body, in any healthy environment, this comes naturally. It doesn't take any effort for when a child that's born healthy has 75 trillion cells, trillion, not billion, and has thousands and thousands of systems. And thank God, a healthy child, a healthy adult, they all work in tandem, they all work in synchronicity and harmony with each other. But not because they are losing their identity, but because each one both has an individual identity and at the same time seems to know that it's part of a whole. So God forbid if, let's say, there was an organ convention, and all the organs in the body said, you know what, in the name of understanding each other, let's exchange roles. The heart will be the mind for a day, the mind will be the heart. The liver will be the kidneys will be the pancreas. You know, what would happen? You'd have destruction, you'd have chaos, you'd have a disaster. But their intentions are so good, let's understand each other, you know. But it doesn't work that way. Because the paradox is that it's in your uniqueness and being you that allows you to really complement all the others. If you try to be someone else, you're not achieving unity, you're achieving destruction. Now, if you went mathematically, it doesn't sound logical. If I want to be like you and you be like me, that sounds like we'll understand each other better. But it doesn't work that way. So how do you explain this? So the Hasidic masters explain it from a divine perspective, that God is neither an individual, the godly divine power is neither individualistic nor group, and therefore it can bring together both of them. Because when you think of it, it really comes down to this. If you ask yourself, why is it when you put a piece of food in your mouth, you know how many systems, you know how many processes begin to happen for that food to become part of your flesh and blood? Hundreds and hundreds of steps. First of all, the teeth have to chew it and break the food down, right? Then there's the swallowing process. Then there's the next enzymes that break it down further, the waste that has to be eliminated, the parts that goes right into your bloodstream, the other parts that go to different parts of the body. It's so complex, no one even knows the whole process completely. We know generally today. Now, you say to yourself, who exactly is calling the shots here? Why is it not like, why are there no malfunctions? Now, God forbid there are times, I'm not saying there aren't, but millions and millions of people, there are no malfunctions. Why? So you have to say there's some captain of the ship, like a conductor of the symphony, that seems to be telling everyone, okay, do your role. When that comes, and as soon as you finish, the next one begins. People will say, I read somewhere an article, what is one of the most amazing achievements of modern technology? So some people say the computer, and some say the smartphone, and say this and that. They say, no, you know what it is? You won't believe it. You will never guess it. It's FedEx and UPS. It's considered to be the most fascinating part of today's modern achievements. You know why? They have to deliver millions of packages a day and make physical packages. Technology, once you master digital tools, it's a whole different story. Here it's human error. You have to literally bring parcels and packages from here to here and manage millions of packages is considered to be one of the biggest feats in today's human feats. I know you'd never think of it because we never think of the physical delivery as being such a big thing. But to coordinate all that, UPS has the largest fleet of planes, more than all the commercial airlines combined. Did you know that? Yeah. You wouldn't guess these things. Check it out. Google it all. My point that I'm trying to make is, why is it such an achievement? Because you're dealing with humans. It's one thing, a computer, so it's a program, and you fix the program, you tweak it till you get it going. That's it. The program will not defy you. But humans defy planning. The guy's a little delayed. There's a weather condition. There's this, there's that. He made a mistake with the address. There's so many variables that can go wrong. To get like 90 or 95% success rate is an achievement. So the point being is, because we humans are the only ones that disrupt the harmony of existence. Let's put it that way. Why that is because of the purpose of our existence, because we are here to play a role in a partnership with God in making the world a better place. Any partnership always has a risk, because the partner can decide to not do it, but they have to do. The rest of the world is not a partner. The rest of the world is part of the players of the game. So there seems to be a captain of the ship, let's say in the human body, that's telling each part what to do at its given moment. So there it works. But when it comes to humans, this is where loneliness jumps in. Because suddenly, when you feel that you're not connected to the other musical notes, so then you feel alone. What do you do in response? You start losing your own uniqueness because you want to be with others. So you begin to conform. This is essentially the psychology of conformity. Why do people want to conform? Nobody likes to be called a conformist, right? You wouldn't consider that a compliment if someone told you you're a conformist, you never do anything original, you have no mind of your own, herd mentality, you're just following everybody. Nobody likes to hear that. And yet, most of the world are conformists. I haven't spoken to 7 billion people, but I could tell you from the places I've spoken to, and every time I ask any conformists in the room, nobody ever raises their hand. So basically, 7 billion people don't want to acknowledge they're conformists, but they are. Or else advertising wouldn't work, or else communities wouldn't work. And I'm not even suggesting all conformity is bad. But the real psychology behind it is because we don't want to be alone. Which is why the opening of the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, you know what the statement says? Al yevash mipnei hamaligim. Don't be embarrassed for those that will mock you. The hardest thing is to be feeling mocked, to feeling isolated, feeling rejected. You see this in school, bullying, or other factors. When a child feels rejected by the group, it's a very devastating experience. I'm not comparing it to other forms of abuse, but psychologically, what it does is it undermines your own sense of value. And this, of course, is also damage done in a home and a family, where parents project their own insecurities and want to shape their children in their own image. In other words, instead of embracing and celebrating the unique identity of each child, you want to shape them the way you want. You're basically destroying their confidence in their own individuality, which forces you to have to become a conformist because you need to be you want to be happy. You want to please. You want to feel good. And you'll feel good because everyone says, oh, wow, this guy is great. He's a team player. He makes everybody else happy. But who suffers? You. Because the you inside, there's no mili. Now it's all about everyone else. So the interesting irony or paradox is that in the real scheme of things, the more you are yourself, the more you can complement the whole. And the more the whole can complement you. It's the exact opposite. Like I said before, if anybody wants to lose their identity to become somebody else because they'll be accepted, what actually really happens is you're undermining because you're not playing your role in the process, which is why Hillel doesn't open up the statement that says, first be part of a community. He says, first be you, and then realize that the you needs others. Because if you start the other way around, you'll never discover yourself. The Baal Shem Tov has a very powerful thought, which relates to so many areas of life about individuality, and Judaism, of course, in particular, where he asks the question we say 3 times a day in the Shemoneh Esrei and Amida. We say, Elokeinu ve'elokei Aviseinu, Elokei Avram, Yitzchok v'Yaakov. We say it. My God, our Elokeinu, our God, my God, Elokei Aviseinu, the God of my parents, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So the question he asks is, the chronological order was the other way around. First it was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So you should first say Elokei Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, then Elokei Aviseinu, then the God of our parents, and then Elokeinu, my God, our God. That's the order. And his answer is simple but brilliant, and lies at the heart of so much of life. He says, because when you're a child, you begin by learning about God from your parents. They teach you about God. But when you become an adult, it has to be Elokeinu. You have to own your God. You're not worshiping the God of your parents, you're worshiping your God. Not that it's a different God, I mean to say the God that you have figured out to embrace. And then you acknowledge and say, this is also the God of my parents and the God of the patriarchs, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Owning something, which is one of the hardest things, because it's so much easier to just rely on the crutch of whatever was given to you. Okay, this is what the community says, this is what the rabbis say, this is what the parents say. So there's sometimes you need to rely, obviously, on someone that if you don't know better, but if you don't own your choices and you don't own your life, you don't own your actions, there has to be an element of deep resentment within, because ultimately your inner self is not being identified, and you're the first one that is defiling your own identity, your own self. How to balance all this is a challenge, and we'll talk about it some more soon. But the first thing must be stated, as Hillel says, Im ein ani li mili, which has on its own a certain element of, you can describe, of a lonely state. And the word alone, aloneness. But it has a great beauty to it, because it's really about your uniqueness that you're embracing and you're comfortable with. You're comfortable in your own skin. Now, people are comfortable in their own skin. You could pretty much see it often. It's very visible. Even people not comfortable in their own skin can see it. You see people who are just there. They're not trying to perform. They're not trying to please. They're just themselves. There's a certain lack of self-consciousness. There's just a certain, they don't take themselves so seriously. It's not that all, it's not all orchestrated. You could sense it. You ever go to a party and you walk in the room, you immediately feel the tension. You know where it's coming from. It's usually coming from the top, which means the hosts. Tense hosts create tense guests. I don't know if that's said anywhere, but maybe here it is. And the vibes. When you come into a place where you feel comfortable, is because usually the hosts are comfortable. They're comfortable with themselves, and therefore they make everybody else comfortable. That's how it is. And being comfortable in your own skin is one of the great blessings, because it's almost like it's like an invisible factor. It's not like something you can learn how to do. But really it means that you're at peace with yourself, and you're at peace of being alone with yourself, and you're at peace with your own uniqueness. And that actually, as I said before, ironically, sets the stage and creates the fertile ground for you really to coexist with others. Anyone comfortable with themselves has no problem with other people. You don't need to be wrong for me to be right if I'm comfortable with my positions. When I'm not, if I'm insecure, then the only way for me to be right is make sure everybody else is wrong. In other words, everything is not about generating from within. It's, everybody else is saying that. They're great. Now, we all understand, all of us human beings like compliments, and we like to be validated and be appreciated. I'm not suggesting that being completely secure doesn't require that. But if your whole life is driven simply by accolades and what others will say, you're not really comfortable with yourself. And unfortunately, that usually begins from home. It's parents who are not comfortable with themselves will usually create children that are not comfortable with themselves. That's how it is. That doesn't mean our destiny is sealed. It simply means that's a challenge. But you have to always know that statement, mili. You must always know that at the core of yourself lies a very unique and special individual. And that's why in Judaism, and this goes to me, for me this goes beyond religion and beyond faith even, the greatest statement and the opening statement in the Bible, the Torah, and I would say is the foundation of everything, more than any other mitzvah. It's not even a mitzvah, is the first description of the human being. So the Torah depicts and describes what was created day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5. So you have day 1, you have light. Day 2, the separation between the higher heavens and lower. Day 3, vegetation. Day 4, the luminaries. Day 5, the animals, fish, the sea. And then day 6 is the human being. And what does it say about the human being? It's interesting, how would the Bible describe? People don't appreciate the Bible's, first of all, its brevity. In just a few sentences, you have the whole story of love, you have the whole story of good and evil, all in Genesis, all in the beginning of Genesis. How is the human being described? Not as an intellectual creature, not as an emotional creature, not even as a creature of free will, even though it's hinted to. It's described in a very cryptic and spiritual way. God says, we'll create someone in our image, in God's image. The human being is created in the divine image. Now, I don't know if you ever stopped to think about why the Bible chooses that way to describe a human being. Which, who would describe it that way? No scientist would. No anthropologist. No one would describe a person that way. So initially, most of us just think, okay, that's the religious description. There's a God, but today, you ask a scientific definition of a human being, they'll say human being is a sophisticated mammal that evolved from the ape, but now the brain has gotten larger, and therefore can, etc., and all the rest of that's described. But if you really think about it, what the Torah is saying is something fascinating. It's not even about God per se as a religious God. It's saying that every human being is godlike. Every human being has something that is absolutely divine. It's not arbitrary. And something divine is absolute. That means your uniqueness that makes you feel alone is actually the divine uniqueness that you have that I don't have. So every human being on earth has something that's indispensable. It's like you're the only one that can play your musical note. Now you think about it that way, think about a human being in that way, you could understand the Torah's importance. Because if the Torah had said a human being is intelligent and emotional, or other things about us, that's all correct. But it doesn't tell you the real heart and soul what makes a human being a human being. And that is the uniqueness of who you are as an individual. To put it in more psychological terms, is that you truly matter, that you are indispensable, that you and everything you do matters now and forever. You tell me if that's not the foundation of any significant life. Because if you don't think you really matter, if you don't think you in any way have anything unique to contribute, if you think someone else can do what you did, how invested will you be in your choices? The whole Torah will fall apart. Because someone will say, why would I have to dedicate myself to be a good person and do this mitzvah and that mitzvah? All that becomes arbitrary or negligible because it doesn't really matter. Who cares? If I don't do the job, someone else will. You know that story they tell, the parable of a poor town who was part of a large kingdom, and news comes to the town that the king is going to visit this town. It was a big thing. The king didn't visit all the towns, especially a poor town like this. So it was like a big honor, once in a history, once a lifetime. The king of the entire empire is coming to visit us. So all the people got together and said, we're a poor town. We want to give the king a gift. What can we do to honor his visit? And everyone was weighing in. Then they came up with an idea. We'll put a big barrel in the middle of the town. And since we don't have much, we all have a little. Everyone will pour a bottle of wine into the barrel. And the king will appreciate the fact that we give them a barrel of wine, of all the wine from our city. Being that we don't have money, he knows that we don't have anything else, any riches. Relative to our situation, this would be considered a very special gift. Now, wine was a very precious commodity, especially for people who have nothing. And, need it for Shabbos, for holidays, and so on. So, of course, the smart Jews in town, one smart Jew says to himself, listen, everybody else is pouring wine into the barrel. I could pour a pitcher of water. What difference is it going to make anyway? In a big barrel, everybody else. The problem was that it wasn't only one smart Jew in town. Everybody was so smart. So what ended up happening was the king got a big barrel of water. Because everybody thought everybody else is pouring wine. What difference does it make? This is the classic example. Well, they say this one, I don't know where it comes from, Chicken Soup with a Soul, one of these parable stories, where the guy's he's going on the beach and he's throwing these starfish back into or the shells, whatever, back into the water. Because once they get beached, they die. So he's throwing them back. Now, so someone says to him, what are you doing? There are millions of them. It doesn't matter. He says, yeah, but to this shellfish it matters. In other words, it's not about whether everyone else is doing it or not. It's the uniqueness of an individual. And in the increasingly depersonalized world in which we live, due to technology, the global village, the speed of things, everything is so mass-produced, industrialization, it becomes very difficult sometimes to sense that you have anything unique. What one person among 7 billion people, what difference can you really make? So it ends up being you can make a difference in your community, in your home, and your environment. But on a cosmic level, does it really matter? And that's why the Torah begins, absolutely, you are a piece of God. You are in the divine image, and just like God is the only absolute reality, more than the entire materialistic universe, it doesn't matter how many. I remember my grandmother who had 9 children, my mother being the oldest, so there was a journalist came around and saying to her, so how do you spread out the love to 9 children? If you had 3, 4 children, you'd have a lot more love to be able to give to each one of them. And I remember my grandmother who was... in her own way, she says to him, she was from the old home, she says to him, you don't have any children, right? Right, which was obvious from that question. She says, think of it like the sun. The sun is reflected in as many drops of water that you have. If you have 1,000, it's the same sun dropped in each one of them. Love is not quantity, it's quality. It doesn't matter how many children you have. You give all the love to each child. And I remember sitting there, I was a kid. The journalist was blown away. Because he never thought of it that way. He was talking like a statistician, let's say you have that many cupcakes, you can only give it out to that many people, So when it comes to that type of quality of love and that level, there the individual absolutely matters. Now, you want examples for it? We have in technology today many examples. You can have computer code that has millions of lines of code, add 1 dot, or take out 1 dot, and the whole code won't work. So don't ever think that an individual does not matter. Today, we understand, with the whole globalization of the world and all the power of technology, if anything, we understand the power of a microscopic detail. God forbid 75 trillion cells, and one cell is a mutation, kind of havoc it wreaks. An extra chromosome is Down syndrome. So don't ever think that individual, just because it's small, or because it's only one, doesn't matter. This is what the Torah says right in the beginning. And you think about it, it's an unbelievable statement. Because the Torah is stating first, before we even begin talking about the laws and the mitzvahs and the obligations, first we have to establish that you are valuable. You're invaluable. You're priceless. And if you don't have that statement, everything else becomes arbitrary or negligible or, optional. Let's put it that way. And an optional life cannot be a meaningful life. An optional life cannot be a life of commitment. Because then it's optional, it doesn't work out, we'll do it a different way. That's not the case. It's absolute. There are things that I'm all the way in. Anyone that has loved in their life, anyone has children, anyone that has experienced real things like that, know that it's not a matter of, it's optional. You know what? Okay. That same grandmother that I had, she passed away a number of years ago, 9 children. So I remember when my uncle, one of the 9, was killed in a car accident. And my grandmother, of course, her whole life changed after that. No one should ever know the loss of a child. Probably the worst possible thing that could happen to anybody. And I remember I used to come into her, visit her from time to time, and she would mutter, my son, in Yiddish, mein Kind, and I was just broke your heart. So someone would say, 1 second, you have 8 out of 9 left. What's the big thing? I don't mean to be so dismissive. We all understand. Because it has nothing to do with numbers. It's complete quality. And that's what the Torah says, that every human being put on this earth is chosen by God, you and no one else, for a particular mission that only you and no one else can accomplish. It's straight, simple as that. And the question is, are you going to do that in your life or not? Everything else is secondary. What type of job you'll have, how much money you'll make, how much success you have. These are all technicalities. It comes down to one thing. You were sent here for a purpose. And a singular purpose, your purpose. No one else can do it but you. Are you going to do it? Now, most people have never even heard this statement made. Even if you hear it, then you say, okay, so what's that purpose? Let me know what I have to do. But we're so busy already. Life is what happens to you while you're busy making other plans, right? Who said that one? John Lennon? I don't know, one of these guys. That you get so preoccupied with your life, you're busy with the means. We have very big tool chests, hammers and screwdrivers and wrenches and everything, but what are you using it for? The purpose, the mission statement of any business is the driving engine of everything. What is our purpose? And this brings me back to the loneliness. When you have that, there's no room for loneliness. There's room for uniqueness. But then you know that what makes you unique is exactly what you were put here for. And then you know, as I said with the musical notes, that you need everybody else, because after the Eina Nili Mili, Imanila Atzmi Ma'ani. In other words, you know that you need other musical notes as well. And it's not a contradiction. They work perfectly hand in hand. So getting to know yourself and getting to appreciate yourself. Yes, even in your uniqueness, where you can say some people may not understand and so on, but you don't look at it like in a negative way. You look at it as a positive. That's my uniqueness. That's why I'm unique, because I get it and someone else doesn't get it. That's my job to do. But that sets the stage, as I said before, for you to be able to coexist and work with others, because the more secure you are, the more you're secure with others. People who have a strong sense of identity are the ones that coexist with everybody. Because again, as I said, they don't need to take away anything from anybody else. They're secure with their position. Others don't have to be wrong for them to be right, as I pointed out. You don't have to be less for me to be more, because there's enough for each other. Again, another Kotzker Rebbe story. Someone came to him in town in Kotsk and said to the Rebbe that he has some type of shop, some business, and someone else opened up a similar business across the street, and he wants the Rebbe to close him down. Hasagas Gvul. Hasagas Gvul is a law in Judaism that says unfair competition. It doesn't apply to all situations, but it applies to some situations that if you take away someone else's parnasa, livelihood, not the exorbitant profits, livelihood, their survival. So there are laws about Hasagas Gvul, meaning not to breach someone else's boundary, so to speak. Which is why you have in certain situations, you'll have certain laws that don't let I don't know if it applies in American law and so on, but there are laws where there has to be some distance between two, if there's only a small population, and there's only and there's only that much bread that has to be sold. So you have certain laws of keeping keeping a certain distance between one business and the next. Now, it's not such simple laws, because you have to establish that it's really a loss and that your survival independent. Again, it's not about lower profits; it's about survival in most cases. So this guy came to the Kotzker Rebbe, said to him that he wants him to close down the other company, the other business. So the Kotzker Rebbe, in his inimitable, incisive, sharp way, says to him, you ever see when horses go to the water to drink? A horse goes over to a lake or to some body of water to take a drink. Something strange happens. The horse goes over to the water. Before it drinks, it begins to stamp its feet. If you ever see a horse, it starts stamping its feet. Why is it stamping its feet? So he says, you know why? Because the horse goes over to the water and suddenly sees another horse, a reflection of itself. So he thinks another horse is coming to drink my water. So it starts stamping its feet to get rid of the other horse, to chase it away. And what happens, the Kotzker Rebbe said, then the horse realizes there's enough water for both of them. That was his response, that he's not closing down the other guy's shop. Well, if you think about it, it's not just a business thing, it's also psychological. Sometimes, and this is sad, it's called Schadenfreude in German. In Yiddish, there's a word called Nicht vergehen. How do you translate it in English? Schadenfreude, I think, is the translation used. I don't know if there's another English word for it. What is it? It's a very disgusting midah, very disgusting attitude, which means you simply cannot, there's a word that you cannot stand, huh? Tolerate, but more than that, when someone else is successful. Zen nene v'zelei chaser, midas daim, which means this one, someone benefits, and you gain nothing from their you lose nothing from their benefit, but you simply cannot. What was the word? You cannot not tolerate. If again, there's another word. There is another word. You can't. You're not at peace with it. Why? Think of this emotion. Why would that be? If a person gains and you lost, so you could say, okay, listen, I could have gained, so I resent. That's what I'm saying. You resent the person. So you could say you resent because you lost something. Even then, there's a divine providence. The guy was lucky. Fine, he came first. He got it. Whatever it may be. But here, there's nothing. You gain nothing. You lose nothing from that person's gain. And yet, there's some people just simply want others to be losers. So my theory about it is because if you yourself deep down feel you're a loser, or maybe not so deep down, on the surface you know you're one, it just feels better when everybody else is a loser. Because that way you don't stand out as being so bad. Because everybody else is failing. So it doesn't matter if I fail, okay, I'm not so bad. But if someone else succeeds, it glaringly puts you in context that you're not succeeding. I don't know if that's the reason or not, but I like that explanation. If you have others, you can submit them. The point I want to make is that loneliness, this sense of loneliness, is really a negative sense of something that should be actually causing someone to be positive, which is that you are unique, you are an individual, you have a role to play, and the price that comes with that, that there are parts of your life that others may not fully appreciate or understand. And so be it. That's nothing wrong with that. Even in a marriage, even when two people completely love each other, they become like one flesh. They don't remain unique. Ask people who are married for many years, they'll tell you, the longer I'm married, the less I understand my spouse. But they smile and they're completely at peace with it. Whereas someone in the early marriage says, if that's the case, I would never marry someone. But you know something? You come to appreciate the mystique and the mystery of individuals. And it doesn't mean you have to understand or own everything for you to appreciate it. It's the illusion in this world of acquisitions that we think we have to own everything. If I don't own it, then it's not mine. But ownership is only for people who are insecure, people who are completely comfortable with themselves. Why do they have to own other people? Now, I'm not saying it's always easy. Obviously, there are times we all, I'm sure, resort to a more juvenile attitude of jealousy or pettiness and so on. But when you think about it with your mind, not emotionally, it's very clear it doesn't make any sense. It's completely based on your own insecurities. So going back to the point here is that in that sense, am levoded yishkin, bodod, in a positive way, is a very positive thing. There's uniqueness. And don't be afraid of your own uniqueness. Get comfortable with it. If parents and your community helped cultivate and nurture and validate your uniqueness, then that's the greatest. But even if they haven't, so learn to embrace it yourself. And that in no way, that will not make you more apart. That will then allow you to come to the second half of Hillel's statement. If I'm only for myself, what am I? Because then you realize, okay, that's my uniqueness, but now I know that it's just like I'm unique, so are you. And now let's exchange uniquenesses, like that. What do they call it? Leonard Cohen puts it this way, let's be alone together. Alone, again, he means it in a negative way. People who live lonely all their life, so they might as well be alone together. Since we're using pop songs, I might as well bring the other lonely lines from Billy